In this lecture segment, we are talking about 16th century Italian Renaissance art. We are focusing on the contributions of Michelangelo and Raphael. Michelangelo is born outside of Florence in 1475, so around the time that Leonardo is painting Ginevra da Vinci's portrait. He's from a low-ranking noble family that had little money. He grows up in Florence, and against his father's wishes, he becomes an apprentice to a Florentine artist and eventually attracts the attention of the Medici, and spends some time in the early 1490s studying sculpture in their garden, where they had a collection of classical sculptures. This is probably how he learned to carve marble, copying antique works of art and studying them closely. This work is one of his earliest sculptures, made when he's a teenager, and you can see what interests him as an artist. In this lecture segment, we are talking about 16th century Italian Renaissance art. We're focusing on the contributions of Michelangelo and Raphael. Michelangelo was born outside of Florence in 1475, so around the time that Leonardo is painting Ginevra da Vinci's portrait. He's from a low-ranking noble family that had little money. He grows up in Florence, and against his father's wishes, he becomes an apprentice to a Florentine artist, and eventually attracts the attention of the Medici, and spends some time in the early 1490s studying sculpture in their garden, where they had a collection of classical sculptures. This is probably how he learned to carve marble, copying antique works of art. This work is one of his earliest sculptures, made when he's a teenager, and you can see what interests him as an artist. He loves to depict the male body, as you see in this hulky baby Jesus. He is exposed to humanism, Neoplatonism, and classical texts. He takes his learning even further by dissecting corpses and, like Leonardo, developing significant knowledge of the human body firsthand. He signs his name as Michelangelo Scultore, calling himself a sculptor, and although he can paint and works as an architect, he thinks of himself as a sculptor. He's the first artist we've talked about whose work does epitomize what many people think the Renaissance is, the revival of all things classical. Michelangelo's work has very strong connections to classical art, and he will be Vasari's Renaissance hero. When things go awry for the Medici in Florence and they lose control of the city, Michelangelo goes traveling and ends up in Rome. We have not gotten to talk about Rome in about 1,000 years. Its population shrank dramatically after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and it struggled for centuries. But the papacy, meaning the Pope, whose base of power is in Vatican City in Rome, works to revitalize the city and make it an attractive pilgrimage destination, using art and architecture to reaffirm the power of the church. But it's still Rome. It's a city filled with antique leftovers. This is a 1493 view of Rome, and we see the Pantheon, the Colosseum, Old St. Peter's, and sculpture everywhere. Michelangelo is in hog heaven, going all over the city sketching, and this immersion in classical style has a huge effect on his work. He gets a commission to make a sculpture for a cardinal's burial chapel at Old St. Peter's. It's a prestigious commission from a high-ranking church official who was from France. This cardinal requests an iconography common in Northern Europe, the Pietà, a moment associated with the lamentation, but in this case the body of Christ is on Mary's lap and she mourns her child's death. You can see a German example of this iconography. It's a pretty expressive work. The Pietà is an iconography that presents some interesting challenges for Michelangelo. How does one take a deceased body of a full-grown man and put him on the lap of a woman such that she can hold him? Michelangelo resolves this problem by turning Mary's body and the drapery covering her form into a platform for the body of Christ. In doing so, he's able to create this stable Renaissance composition with this pyramidal form made up of so much drapery and these carefully positioned bodies. He depicts Mary as an idealized young woman with a beautiful face. In his carving of the marble, he distinguishes between the texture of skin, hair, and fabric, using virtuoso techniques that he learned from classical sculpture. Look at how the Virgin's hand puckers the fabric that surrounds the body of Christ. He reportedly goes to the quarry and personally selects the block of marble that he used to create this sculpture. For Michelangelo, this work of art was a statement of what he was capable of doing, his big announcement that he could deliver on a prestigious commission. This is reaffirmed by the prominent signature across the chest of the Virgin that says in Latin, Michelangelo Buonarroti Florentine made this. Interestingly, this is the only sculpture that he signs with his name, and he very much does it here to declare himself as a creator who is open for business. After things calm down in Florence, Michelangelo heads home and gets a commission to sculpt a 17-foot block of partially carved marble that had been sitting around at the cathedral's workshop for a few decades. The commission was from the Cathedral Works Department for a depiction of the Old Testament prophet David, to be placed up on the cathedral near Brunelleschi's dome. You can see in this temporary installation from a couple of years ago a copy of the David. He spends 3 years carving his depiction of David, which is quite different than earlier depictions. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo overhauls the conventions for representations of David. David, according to the story, was a teenager, tasked with fighting the Philistine giant Goliath. He slung a stone at him using a slingshot, hit Goliath in the head, and Goliath died. A story of the little guy, or the underdog, beating the big bad guy. Florence had an established tradition of thinking of themselves as the little guy, and already had a collection of David sculptures at the City Hall. Here you see the handful of David depictions that were at the City Hall, all of which Michelangelo would have been familiar with. So what does he do differently? He depicts an older David, not an adolescent, but a youngish man. He chooses a different moment in the story. Earlier versions showed the moment after David had won, as he stands on the severed head of Goliath. Instead of the elegant, lean forms of the earlier Davids, Michelangelo depicts David as a hero with a nude body, as well as idealized musculature like we saw in classical sculpture, even employing the contrapposto pose we saw in the spear bearer, with an engaged leg, a relaxed leg, an arm holding something, and an arm at rest. Michelangelo had learned his lessons from classical sculpture. Michelangelo chooses a moment of psychological intensity. David has this furrowed brow that shows him thinking about what he has to do, the stillness before the battle. So even though these all have the same iconography, Michelangelo shifts from a young triumphant adolescent to a hero in contemplation before the action. It's a stunningly carved sculpture. Look at the veins in the hands, the drill work in the curls of the hair, his relaxed arm holding the stone with the careful delineation of the joints of the thumb and the thumbnail. Michelangelo wrote, "David conquered with his sling and I with my drill." Like the Pietà, this was a fully finished work intended to proclaim what he was capable of as a sculptor. We have the full synthesis of classical style in an idealized nude figure with Christian subject matter. This is a prophet, but he's shown as a hero. The Christian and the pagan, antique, classical have been brought together in harmony. But it also adds another dimension to our understanding of the Renaissance by giving us an example of the significant role art played in public life and in the identity of the city. Michelangelo designed this sculpture to go way up on the cathedral. And that's one of the reasons the hand seems so huge, is that he has taken the viewer's perspective into account, looking up from below. But officials in Florence don't want to put it all the way up on the cathedral where no one can see it. And they decide to put it in front of the City Hall, effectively turning it into a political symbol by removing it from the context of the cathedral, where it would have been a depiction of biblical David, and putting it at the City Hall, where it became a symbol of Florence as the little guy beating the big guy. The big guy in this case was actually the Medici, as this period was one of those when Florence had exiled the Medici. It takes them 4 days to move the huge sculpture from the cathedral workshop down here to the City Hall. And after it is installed, pro-Medici vandals attack it. Renaissance Florence was a vibrant context for art, as it was an integral part of everyday life and identity for citizens and city. Michelangelo gets called to Rome by Pope Julius II to work on a commission he did not want, painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Painting was not his preferred medium, but he painted the ceiling of the space in fresco for 4 years. The Sistine Chapel is the Pope's private chapel, built in 1475 next to St. Peter's. Other works of art were already on the walls, and Michelangelo's job was to create a huge cycle of images for the ceiling, depicting scenes from the Old Testament, from the creation of the world through Noah. You can see a portion of the ceiling here to help you get an idea of human scale. The chapel has an important official function today as the meeting space for choosing a new pope. And then here you can see the whole ceiling, and then a diagram of a complex iconographic program. The Old Testament scenes run down the center of the ceiling, but are surrounded by fictive or fake architecture and an array of figures. Michelangelo depicts prophets and sibyls, or pagan women who foretold Christ's coming, who Michelangelo depicts using male bodies, just slightly altered. In this sketch, you can see him carefully working out the position of the body down to its toes and the way the muscles respond to the torsion of the position. We also see ignudi, which are these nude male figures throughout the ceiling who adopt twisted pretzel-like poses. These ignudi have no theological or doctrinal justification. It appears that Michelangelo included them because the nude male form was his favorite subject, and if he couldn't sculpt it, he could at least paint it. We are focusing on the creation of Adam. In this scene, Adam's creation is not yet complete, and he does not yet have the spark of life, which God is about to put into him. Adam is weak and limp, but deity is vibrant and strong. Like we saw with the balanced composition in Masaccio's Trinity, Michelangelo depicts a balanced scene: weak, strong, young, old, earth, sky. The pose of their bodies is also related, like a pair of parentheses. Michelangelo devoured newly discovered classical sculptures in Rome. The late Greek Laocoon was dug up from a field in Rome in 1506 and was in the Pope's collection, influencing the more densely muscled figures he depicts. He also had access to the Belvedere torso that you see here, which he sketched, and which he clearly used in depicting Adam's form. Like we saw with the Sibyl, Michelangelo used drawing to figure out the poses of his figures and to work out the musculature of the bodies, using his understanding of anatomy, with a healthy dose of classical sculpture, to help depict bodies that are both idealized and naturalistic. Both Adam and God employ a similar pose to the Belvedere torso, almost like bookends, mirroring each other's poses. We can certainly tell what most interests Michelangelo, the nude male form, and what he's directed most of his artistic attention to, which is the bodies. Check out the landscape by contrast. Swath the green, swath the blue equals earth and water. In these details of the heads of Adam and God, we see how Michelangelo uses paint to create sculptural forms. The figures have hard edges, and he's clearly more interested in depicting muscle and flesh than hair. We get a sense of the intensity of God with his furrowed brow like the David, versus the more passive expression of Adam. This project was frustrating for Michelangelo, and he wrote a poem about his experience that you can see here, along with a sketch of him bending his head backwards to paint the ceiling. In the poem, he talks about how his brush is above his face, dripping paint constantly, and at the end he says, "Come to the rescue of my dead painting now. I'm not in a good place, and I'm no painter." But he succeeded in pleasing the Pope and in giving the Pope what he wanted, a grand statement of the triumph of Christianity as he merged Greek and Roman culture, style, art, with Christian subject matter, context, and purpose, and in doing so, reaffirmed the power of the Pope as the head of Christ's Church. And it had quite an impact, as just down the hallway, Raphael was working on another project for the Pope, painting frescoes on the walls of the Pope's library. Partway through the ceiling, the Pope had Michelangelo pull down the scaffolding so he could see the progress. We think Raphael got to see the Sistine ceiling at that point, and it prompted changes in his project. Raphael was not from Florence, but grows up surrounded by art in the court of a duke. His father is a painter, and Raphael heads to Florence in 1404 and soaks up all the art history lessons Florence had to offer. He's a chameleon artist, absorbing what he sees in the style of others and turning into something that is his own. His task in this room is to paint 4 frescoes, like a card catalog, telling a person what books would be kept in shoulder-high cases along the walls of the room. This fresco was painted to mark the location of the philosophy books, the texts by pagan authors. We see a synthesis of many of our Renaissance lessons. The scene was constructed using linear perspective, with a vanishing point right between the heads of Aristotle and Plato, as you see in this diagram. Like Masaccio, Raphael carefully planned his fresco in drawings. The architectural setting uses the language of classical architecture in an invented space that is similar to the type of space that was under construction next door, as they were taking down Old St. Peter's and rebuilding it in a classicized style at that moment in history. Some of the faces and gestures appear to have been borrowed from Leonardo's Last Supper, like the head of Plato here. And this setting is filled with ancient philosophers, mathematicians. We see Pythagoras and Euclid and many others. But they are shown here in an ideal realm where the pagan and classical exists in harmony with the Christian, reaffirming the power of the Church and the Pope. And Raphael places himself in this realm in a self-portrait, casting himself as a Renaissance creator in the company of all these great thinkers from the ancient world. As regards the changes in his project after seeing the Sistine ceiling, Raphael starts using bigger figures. And if we compare his cartoon or full-scale drawing, we see a difference between the plan and the finished work. He adds a figure. This hulking man leaning on a block of stone, wearing stonecutter's boots. In what is probably a portrait of Michelangelo, perhaps sulking about having to paint instead of carve. We reach the point in the early 16th century that artists are bringing together classical stuff with Christian stuff, especially using lessons in classical style in the depiction of Christian subjects. This is the Renaissance that Vasari championed, as for him, from Giotto forward, the push towards naturalism and the looking back to classical art brought art to the pinnacle of what he felt it could be.